Hey, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. It's going to be a great Christmas Eve live stream. Going to be a great Christmas Eve live stream. I'm looking forward to it. Got some good things to talk about with all of you. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, bundle up nice and warm if you're in a place where it's cold. Just act normal if you're in a place with a normal climate. And away we go. It's going to be a fun night.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with all of you tonight. I'm looking forward to a nice, warm, relaxing Christmas Eve conversation. It's late at night. We're just a few hours away from Christmas Day, December 25th, here in New York City. I'm in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. My wife and I are staying in and keeping warm this Christmas. We might go to the movies tomorrow, talking to relatives on the phone, stuff like that. Yeah, and why not have the time to talk with all of you? So that's what we're doing here. We're having a Christmas Eve stream. Probably tomorrow night we'll have a Christmas stream, right? We're just going to keep going. I'm here for you all because I enjoy talking to you all. Talking with you guys is part of my routine. It is part of my daily nightly routine. We have a stream on here every day and I love it. I love it. I really do love it. And I am, Thanksgiving is when you're supposed to say what you're thankful for, but Christmas, I am thankful for all of you. I'll tell you that much. From the bottom of my heart, I'm thankful for all of you that we can get on here and have these conversations about the topics that are very important. So the way we do things here, for those who may not be familiar, is I give my opening remarks. While I'm giving the opening remarks, I am writing down super chat questions. Then in the second half of the show, I answer those questions. After the opening remarks, we do the roll call. After the roll call, I call people out names and locations. We find out who's on the other side of the camera. And then I answer super chat questions. And that's the way we roll. That's how we do it here. So hit the like button, make sure to hit the subscribe button, make sure to hit the notifications bell, and let's just jump right into this. For those of you who are celebrating the Christmas holiday, Merry Christmas. For those of you who observe Hanukkah, Happy Hanukkah. To those of you who observe the Black nationalist holiday of Kwanzaa, Crazy Kwanzaa, Kwanzaa greetings, and to everyone else, a Happy New Year pretty soon, 6 days after Christmas. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's Christmas Eve 2022, soon to be 2023. And, my whole life I have struggled not to be too superstitious. There's always a part of my mind that is has got magical thinking, wants to make numerical associations, etc. But you don't want to go there. You don't want to go there. You don't want to start saying, well, all the lucky things in my life happen around the number 7, or all the lucky things in my life happen around the number 9 or the number 12. Or, I once read a biography of John Lennon that talked about how all of the big things in his life happened around the number 9. And it had a list of it was pages and pages of things, big events in John Lennon's life that revolved around the number 9. And you don't want to go there. you really don't want to go there. If you get too much into that kind of magical thinking, you'll lose your mind. So I try not to go there. I really try not to go into magical thinking too much in my mind. I try not to associate unassociated events. I try not to link unrelated things. I try not to observe patterns that are nonsensical, because at the end of the day, you just have to keep living your life. But that said, there's part of me that looks at the upcoming year of 2023 and says it's going to be big. It's going to be a big year. It's going to be a big year. Part of me looks at the upcoming year and says, Caleb, it's going to be big. It's going to be a big year. And I hope that's true, and I hope that it's big in a good way. And I think it will be. I've already got some plans. March 25th, we're having a conference for the Center for Political Innovation. Our next big live event will be happening. Not sure where yet. Details to be announced. Yeah, I'm optimistic. And I try not to get too magical in my thinking. I try not to get too superstitious. I try to maintain an objective assessment of events, an objective view of reality. But myths and legends and stories are all very important to human beings. And they serve a purpose. For example, I hate to disappoint any of my fellow Christians who may have not been aware of this, but Jesus Christ was not literally born on December 25th. Didn't happen. December 25th is not technically the birthday of Jesus Christ. We don't know the actual date of Jesus' birth, but December 25th was picked, and the Christmas holiday has been selected because of the winter solstice and because of winter in Europe. And the tradition of Yuletide, the pagan holiday from which Christmas is derived, is a very important holiday. It says a lot. For example, at Christmas time, Yuletide, it's very dark outside. It's very cold. So it was very important for people to keep their spirits high, to be around their relatives, to keep warm together. Because this time of year can be hard on people psychologically. So it was important to have gatherings to celebrate. When people weren't out growing crops or doing food, they had a lot more free time in the winter time, and so it was time to come together. Why is it that we have pine trees at Christmas time? Why are Christmas trees made out of pine? Well, it's because they're green all year round. Other trees lose their leaves in the fall. Other trees turn brown. But the pine tree, the Christmas tree, is green all year round, meaning that life is eternal. Meaning that even though it seems like everything is dead in the winter time, some trace of green, some trace of life is still there. And that's why we celebrate with the pine tree, because it's green. And why do we have wreaths, pine wreaths that we put up at Christmas time? Well, the circle represents the circle of life and the seasons, and that green will return. It's cold and freezing now, but give it a few months, everything will be green again. It's a cycle. The cycle of life, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of morning, afternoon, evening, night, then morning again. That circle, that holly wreath, is a circle to celebrate the circle of life. And a lot of the Christmas traditions, a lot of them are rooted in the pagan festival of Yuletide, celebrated by the ancient Germans. And what was the myth of Yuletide? Well, the myth was that in winter, the earth dies. The earth dies. However, when the earth is dead, Odin, an old man with a beard who comes around once a year, an old man with a beard who's very stern. Odin comes around once a year, comes to Earth to blow life back into the earth. And Yuletide is the celebration of Odin coming around to blow life back into the earth, to get the ball rolling again, right? It's getting colder and colder and colder as we get towards the winter solstice, but we hit the winter solstice, and then that's the day when Odin comes down from Valhalla, which is heaven. He comes down from Valhalla, and he blows life back into the earth, and then the ball starts rolling, and then it starts getting warmer and warmer, and the days start getting longer again. And that's the myth of the Yuletide that the ancient Germans celebrated. And so we're putting up the wreaths to celebrate and greet Odin for his return. We're gathering with our relatives to celebrate and rejoice and, use the free time we have because we're not out working in the fields to grow the crops because everything's frozen and cold. We've been storing up and working hard all year, and we have a good supply of food and got things set aside. The harvest has all been taken in. So now we can drink and be merry and celebrate with our relatives in the darkness and cheer for Odin to return to the earth, to blow life back into the earth so we can once again have it be warm and we can go out into the fields and work really hard again. That is the Christmas tradition. It's really common for Christians and evangelicals to reflect on the non-Christian nature of Christmas, right? There's nothing in the Bible about an old man, who brings presents to little children on December 25th. Writing it down. Nothing in the Bible about that, right? Nothing in the Bible about decorating Christmas trees. Nothing in the Bible about pine trees. And the story of Jesus' birth and the pagan festival to celebrate Odin's return to Earth don't exactly line up. It's really cliche. For years, Jehovah's Witnesses and all kinds of Christians have said, the whole Christmas tree thing, the whole Santa Claus thing, it's not really Christian. And in fact, it was pointed out to me that Joy to the World is not a particularly Christian song, even though it was written by a Christian in the 1700s. You actually listen to the lyrics. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her king. Let every heart prepare him room. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. It's about greeting Odin, right? This was probably one of these English intellectuals who was involved in masonry and all of that, who had adopted some Odinist or pagan beliefs, right? That joy to the world, you listen to it, there's not much about Jesus in there, right? It's the earth, Mother Earth, is welcoming her king, Odin. He's coming back to the earth, and heaven and nature is greeting him. It's not a very Christian song, right? And that the Christmas holiday, this is a very European tradition. It's very, very ancient European. This predates the Christianization of Europe. This is before the Romans brought Christianity to Europe. The Germans, the Goths and the Vandals and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the barbarians, they were celebrating the Yuletide, the return of Odin. Makes sense. They didn't have these traditions in the Mediterranean. The Romans didn't celebrate that because they don't have much of a winter down there, right? The Persians, the ancient Jews of Palestine, they weren't celebrating this kind of thing because the climate is different. That this is almost a holiday that's designed for the European winter climate, right? This is for that cold winter in Germany, that cold winter in Belgium, that cold winter in Luxembourg or in France or in Normandy, right? The cold winter in England and Scotland and Wales, the cold winter in Ireland. That's, really, really cold winter up in Norway and Denmark and Finland. That's where the Christmas tradition is coming from. And I will point out that the deity who is worshipped on Yuletide, oh, very good. The deity who's worshipped on Yuletide is not a particularly Christian deity. Odin. Odin is not Jesus. Odin is very much the god of grit and valor and sacrifice. Odin is a stern, harsh god. You only get to go to Valhalla, which is Odin's heaven. First of all, you only get to go there if you're a man. If you're a woman, just forget it. Second of all, if you're a man, you can only go if you die in battle. If you die sick in your bed, no. Right? If you die in an accident, no. In order to go to heaven in the Norse and Germanic mythology, you must have died in battle. And if you have died in battle, Odin will send his Valkyries, right? That's the Wagner song. Dun 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 dun. If you have died in battle, then Odin will send the Valkyries dun 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 to take you to the halls of Valhalla. And it was actually a tradition among the ancient Norse men that if they were dying of old age, as they were dying, they would take a knife. They would slice themselves up and down their bodies. And the idea was that then Odin would believe that they had died in a battle, and he would allow them to go to Valhalla. That was the idea. And it's always warm in Valhalla. It's a hall where it's always warm, always nice and warm, never any coldness in Valhalla, and it's lit by the eternal fire. The flames of the fire in Valhalla never go out, and they drink lots of honey, alcohol, mead, or something like that. And that's the ancient Norse myth. And Odin is very much the god of valor. He is very much the god of grit and working hard and sacrificing. Odin wants no excuses. Odin helps you find the strength. Odin's like a football coach, right? Odin's like, go, 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 get him, get him, get him. Odin is a drill sergeant. Odin is not a compassionate, kind, loving, forgiving deity. Odin is very much a hard ass. Odin's a hard ass, if there ever was one. Because of that, I have to laugh, because even though the United States is loaded with Christianity, even though, right, I mean, we're supposed to have no religious holidays in the United States, but Christmas is honored as a federal holiday, it's a federal holiday in the United States, and that even though there's churches everywhere and Christian imagery everywhere, I argue that there's a lot of Odinism in America. First of all, Germans are the biggest white ethnic group in the United States. I don't know if people know that, but Americans in the United States, the biggest ethnic group among white people is German Americans, right? What is the quintessential American food? Hamburgers. Is that because they're made out of ham? No, they're made out of beef. It's because they're sandwiches. They're hamburger sandwiches from Hamburg, Germany. And what is the other quintessentially American food? A hot dog. And what is a hot dog? Well, it used to be known as a Frankfurter sandwich. But then World War I happened and we didn't want to be eating German stuff, so we changed it to hot dogs instead of Frankfurters. And coleslaw. Where do you think coleslaw came from? Right? I mean, America is a very Germanic culture. The most common last name in the United States is Miller, which is a German name. It's Muller. We're a very, very German culture. And, trust me, I grew up in a small town, a lot of Mennonites, right? And, Steiner and Steinbecker and Hofsbach and Kirschbaum and I heard all those German names and Glunzmann and, Klieger. And yeah, I mean, I grew up with people with very, very, very German last names. And, the heartland of America is very, very, very German. Let me just put it that way. There was a huge wave of immigration to the United States from Germany in the aftermath of the failed 1848 revolution. That's the one that Karl Marx was part of, the 1848 German Revolution. And, Marx was part of it, and Wagner was part of it, and the Amish, the Anabaptists, they were part of it, and all kinds of people. There was a big uprising in Germany in 1848 to create a German nation state, and it failed, and a lot of Germans fled the country, and they came to the United States. And the United States is a very German country. And there's a tradition in the United States, which is technically not legal, but it went on quite a bit when I was a kid. And that was in athletic sports in the United States. Before the game, the coach will gather with the players and they'll join hands and they'll pray to God before the game. Now, technically, that's not legal because in the United States, we have the separation of church and state. Our schools are public institutions, government institutions that are required by law to be neutral on matters of religion. We have no establishment of religion. But regardless, we know this happens, especially in the rural areas in the South where you don't have, religious minorities as much to object to it. Before the football game, before the baseball game, before the basketball game, the players are gathering and praying to God. And this may seem like a Christian ritual. It may seem Christian in its nature, right? They're praying to Jesus, you can be sure. But this is actually an Odinist ritual. Why? Because what are they praying when they're praying to Jesus before the game? Are they praying, "Dear Jesus, help us love the other team and forgive them for their shortcomings. Help us to get to be friends with the other team. Help us to share what we have with the other team"? Of course not. That's not what they're praying before the football game. They're not there saying, dear God, help us love the other team. No, they're saying, "Dear God, help us find the strength within us to go out and vanquish the other team and crush them and prove that our athletic ability is the strongest ability there is." That's an Odinist prayer, my friend. Jesus isn't going to help you find the inner strength to devour and defeat your opponents. And that's not a Christian thing to do. I'm sorry. That's Odin. Before the football games, they may think that they are praying to Jesus, but in reality, they are praying to Odin. They're saying, "Dear God, let me get so many wounds out on the football field that when I die, I'm accepted into your great hall of Valhalla, where there are no women, just men, and we're there, and we're big, and we're strong, and we're fighting the enemy." It is the most Odinist tradition ever. And it is. I'm sorry, but this is how these things are. There's a huge Odinist influence on America. And I have told people, well, let me get to my point later. I'll get to that later. But there's a huge Odinist spirit in the United States of America. There is. And we can laugh about it. And sometimes, in some ways, you could argue that that's been to the benefit of the country. Right? They talk about the pioneers, the people who, they didn't like life in Europe. They didn't like feudalism. Most of them were not, it wasn't that they were objecting to feudalism. It's that when feudalism was being ripped apart in what Marx called the so-called primitive accumulation, when they were ripping apart the feudal commons, when they were telling people who'd been peasants on this land for hundreds of years and their parents and their parents before and their parents before had all lived in this same area. And they told them, "Oh, wow, well, now you all have to pay rent and you're wage workers now. You don't have a guaranteed place on the land." And they said, "Well, what are we supposed to do here?" It was the primitive accumulation largely that led to migration to the United States from Europe in the early years. And these were people that were kicked off the land that they'd lived on for thousands of years. Capitalism began with mass theft, and everyone forgets that. People say socialism is theft, but capitalism began with mass theft. First, they stole the United States from the Native Americans. Then they stole and imprisoned and enslaved a bunch of Africans from Africa. Then, before that, they had stolen England, and they stole Germany, and they stole France, and they stole all the public lands and all the commons that existed in feudalism and kicked all the people out. And when they stole Europe, they stole the public lands in Europe, primitive accumulation, and they stole the United States from the Native Americans, and they stole Africa and grabbed a bunch of Africans and took them to the United States. And that, the capitalism is like the origin of capitalism is nothing but a story of mass theft. And so when this theft that Marxists call the primitive accumulation, in which the capitalist class emerged by ripping feudal society to shreds and stealing all the property for itself, the clearing of the Scottish Highlands, the overturning of the commons, the enclosure movement, etc. As that happened, you saw at that point, you saw the mass migration to the United States, and many of the people who came here were very hardworking and people that refused to surrender, and people that said, "All right, you're going to kick me off the land. Well, I'm going to go to a new place. I'm going to start my own land. I'm going to go to a new place." And that's that Odinist spirit. And the American people have grit. And the American people have a hardworking, go-get-'em attitude. And a lot of the bad things about America are ways that the capitalist ruling class has tapped into that mindset and used it for evil. For example, they say, what? Some people over there don't have health care. Well, that's their problem. Right? You work hard, you sacrifice, you'll get health care. They just must not have worked hard enough as you. Right? They must not have worked as hard as you. They must not have worked as hard, as you. That's the attitude. Right? That why should you be concerned about anybody else? Go out and work hard and sacrifice. And the people that are socialists, the narrative goes, well, they're just lazy. They want the government to give them free stuff. They want everything handed to them. They're lazy, but America was built by hard work and grit and struggle and sacrifice. That's the narrative. And there are many of us who become attracted to socialism, myself included, because we're tired of this. We don't like seeing man's indifference to other men. We don't like, people looking down on other people who are struggling. We don't like to see children go hungry. We don't like the thought of people going without health care. And this Odinist way that we've all been trained to think, this belief that we're in it on your own and you do it all by your own hard blood, sweat, and tears, and you do it all. That belief has led to a society where people are isolated from each other. People don't love each other the way they should. People don't have the kind of compassion that they should have. One of the saddest things, I saw this many times, is that among people that are very infected with free market neoliberal ideology, there is this real fear of letting themselves feel compassionate. And I saw this a lot of times, especially when I was in college. I observed this. They would hear about someone who's struggling, would hear about someone who's experiencing hardship. They'd hear about the people who don't have health care. They'd hear about the people who are in a situation where they don't have enough food, or they're having to get food stamps. They get angry. And they get angry. They get very, very angry. And they say, well, it must be their fault somehow. It must be their fault somehow. They must have done something to deserve this. No, the problem is them. It can't be. And they get very angry. And the reason that they get so angry when you tell them about how other people are suffering I'm convinced in a lot of cases, is because if they start to feel sympathy for those other people, if they start to acknowledge that the conditions that these working families are in because of our capitalist system, if people start to realize that there is injustice in the world, and they start to actually feel empathy for these people, then they're going to start to feel empathy for themselves. And then all the hardship and unfairness that they have experienced will be a fact, a reality they just can't ignore any longer. And they have been trying their hardest to have a good attitude. And they've been trying their hardest to not feel like a victim, to not get resentful, to just keep going in life. If they acknowledge that the way this other person has been treated is unfair, then they'll have to acknowledge all the ways that they have been screwed over by this system. And suddenly their ability to just go along with things in life, suddenly their ability to just keep a good attitude and accept the world the way it is will vanish. It'll vanish. And they'll have no choice but to be filled with righteous indignation, not just about what's been done to this poor family or this working class family, but about what's been done to them. And that desire to not feel empathy is a way to protect themselves from feeling empathy for themselves. It's a way to protect themselves from the rage and the anger that is beneath the surface that they are feeling because of how much they've suffered on account of their economic circumstances. And that they realize that beneath their everyone can make it if they just work hard, have a good attitude, beneath that, there is a wave of frustration and disappointment, realizing that this American dream that we've been sold, this idea that if you just work hard enough, everyone can be rich, and realizing that all of that's a big lie. It's all a big lie. There's a group of billionaire monopolists who sit at the top of America enriching themselves because they own the banks and the factories and the industries. And the lower our wages get and the worse our conditions get, the more they enrich themselves. And they're not concerned. They're not concerned about you. They're not concerned about Illinois or Chicago or Minneapolis or Wisconsin or Idaho or Missouri or Texas. They're not concerned about that. They're concerned about Ukraine. They're concerned about their global system. They want have a big fight with Russia to ensure their profits. They could give two shits about the people in your neighborhood or in your community or in your town or your city. They don't care about your family. They care about their profits. And recognizing that and recognizing that family that just got kicked out of their home, that child who's waiting in line with his mother at the food bank, that could be you, because the big monopolies, the imperialists, the international bankers, the corporations that run the world, the richest of the rich have no real human empathy for you. And that we have a serious problem in this country. And the problem isn't that people aren't pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And the problem isn't a lack of grit and valor and sacrifice. The problem isn't a lack of people toughening up. That's not the problem. The problem is we have a system where the most lazy people are the richest and the hardest working people. The people who struggle the most, the people who come home from a shift at work exhausted, the people who are panicking about how they pay their kids, the people that struggle and stress and sacrifice the most are the poorest. That's the kind of society that we have. We have a society where the hardest working people are the ones with nothing, and the laziest people have it all. That's the society we live in, and it's a complete bullshit opposite of the American dream. The American dream is a big lie. It's a big lie. And that's something that's just too much for some people to handle. It's too much for some people to handle. It's just too much for some people to handle. And they want to just stick with, well, I work hard and I don't want to have empathy for anybody else. And I'm going to work hard because they're not ready to swallow that pill. They're not ready to swallow that pill because it's hard enough for them to get through the day as it is. And they don't want to know the truth. It's like that movie that I love, They Live. They don't want to put the glasses on. They don't want to put the glasses on, right? Put the glasses on. They don't want to put the glasses on. They don't want to put those glasses on because they're barely holding shit together now. And imagine if they became aware of how much the game is rigged. Woo. They might not be able to function. So I'm praying for those people tonight. I'm praying for those people tonight. Because I realize for whatever reason, for whatever special opportunities that I've had, for whatever, situations I've been, I, just like most of you watching this right now, have been in life circumstances where I've been able to become aware of how much the game is rigged. And I've been able to come to understand how much we live in a world that is not ruled by God. It is ruled by Satan. We live in a world that is ruled by the devil. We live in a world that is ruled by greed and cruelty and sociopathy and indifference to other people's suffering and individualism and selfishness. And we live in a world that is ruled by darkness. And some people are not ready to come to terms with that yet. However, some people are. Some people are ready to come to terms with that. Some of us are able to kind of see the reality of what's before us. That's what brings me to tonight's message, because those of us who know how bad the world is, we have a responsibility We can't just know what we know. It's not enough to just know what we know. It's not enough to just know what we know. Because if all we do is know what we know and know how much our leaders lie, and know how much these wars that they wage around the world that kill millions of people are based on lies and are crafted to preserve their profits. If we know how much the game is rigged, despite the fact they're always telling us if we just work harder, we can make it, and the game is rigged against us. If we know that, and we don't do anything about it, we're honestly in a worse off spot than the people who don't know. It would be better. It would be better to be one of those people who's in denial about it than it is to be one of the people who knows about it and doesn't do anything about it. Because if you know this, if you know how much the game is rigged, if you know about imperialism and capitalism, if you know all of this, but you don't do anything about it, it's going to eat you alive. It's going to eat you alive. It's like the Matrix. You don't want to take the red pill. You don't want to take the black pill. You just want to pretend you never heard this before. But if you know how evil it is, if you know who really rules this world, if you know how dark things are, and you're just on your own, it's miserable. And that's why the communist internet is so full of negativity. That's why the communist internet is so full of pessimism and bitterness. That's why Jason Unruhe is on there yelling like a maniac and full of rage and pessimism. That's why the communist internet, Twitter, is just full of negative, hateful, destructive. Because if you know this, if you know the game is rigged, but you don't do anything about it, you're not able to actually do anything about it. You're not able to join in a community of other people who have this understanding. You're not able to start building the resistance if you're not able to do that, if you're not able to join arm in arm with other people who understand what you do and actually make a mission out of it and start working toward what you know is the solution, a society where the means of production and the banks and the factories and industries and the centers of economic power are organized to serve the people. If you don't start joining arm in arm with those who've been outcast and starving and getting people that have been downtrodden and degraded to raise their heads up, if you don't start organizing, you don't start connecting yourself to another group of people, a group of people who understand what you understand. If the truth that you have is just a nasty reality that you're aware of, that you bury inside of yourself, it's just a horror movie that you live with, it's going to destroy you. Once you know the truth, the only choice you have is to start doing something about it. And the only way you can do something about it is to be part of a community. The only way you can do something about it is to be part of an organization. The only way you can do something about it is to connect with other people, to combine with other people. Thank you, Gala. Much love to you and Merry Christmas. The only way you can do something about it is if you are able to find other people and support them and have them support you, and together combine your strengths to do something about it. That's the only way. That's the only way. That's the only way you can have this cursed knowledge. That's the only way you can have this cursed knowledge and not be destroyed by it. You have to do something about it. You have to take action. You have to take action. And that brings me to my final point. And my final point is this. If we're going to take action, we have to take action seriously. We have to take action with the understanding that the object is to win. The object is not to kill our guilt. The object is not to feel good about ourselves. The object is to win. And if you seek to win, you can't go to war with everything in the country. And in fact, you need to start thinking about how things in the country, things in the culture, things in the society that currently serve our enemies could be turned around to serve us. If you're in a war, you have to observe the battlefield. And when I talk about Odinism in America, and when I talk about that grit and that struggle and that desire to sacrifice and that hard-working, go-get-'em spirit that Americans have, puts a smile on my face. Because I can look past the way it manifests itself now. I can look past the way it's been hijacked by the forces of neoliberalism, the forces of austerity. I can see into the future. I can see into the future. Because right now in America, socialism is associated with lazy, angry teenagers. Right now, socialism is associated with bitter, pessimistic teenagers who are like, screw this, I want free healthcare. Screw this, I want free college. That's the way it is now. But you just wait. You just wait until socialism gets out of the movement and to the masses. And you just wait until socialism stops being a middle-class bohemian trend and starts being a trend of average working-class Americans. You ever heard of the Green Corn Rebellion in Oklahoma? Go and Google the Green Corn Rebellion. When World War I happened, there was a part of Oklahoma where the U.S. government wanted to draft all the men to fight in World War I. And they said, oh, no, we're not. We're not going to fight in World War I. And they took up arms. And it was in Oklahoma. Oklahoma. If you read Hunter S. Thompson's book about the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, which is a gang, a big, motorcycle gang in the 1970s. He talks about how their parents were all socialists. Their parents, the parents of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were socialists in Oklahoma and North Texas and places like that. And they were socialists and small farmers, members of the IWW. And then, you had the Dust Bowl and they went out to California. But what I'm trying to tell you here is that when socialism begins to spread among the broad masses of Americans, which it will in response to the economic conditions are going to continue to deteriorate because it's based on this problem of overproduction that I've explained on these lives. And until there's dramatic state action to abet the crisis, we're going to continue to have a problem. And as socialism spreads among the masses, we are going to get a socialism that's very, very different than Uncle Bernie. We got Bernie Sanders with his white hair, this nice old man who wants to give health care to all Americans. No. When socialism spreads to the broad masses of Americans, we're going to see that Odinist spirit, that hardworking sacrifice, that is going to be pushed and channeled into socialism. We're going to see a brand of socialism that'll be more radical and revolutionary and hardline and tanky and willing to sacrifice and bold and revolutionary than you can imagine. When middle America goes socialist, it's going to go socialist hard. That's what it's going to do. It's going to go socialist hard. It is going to go socialist hard. And middle America figures out how badly they've been screwed when they figure out that socialism is the answer, that China raised millions of people from poverty, the Soviet Union invented space travel with socialism. You just wait until Missouri and Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas and Alabama and Idaho and Oregon and Washington State and Northern California are crawling with reds. You just wait until there's some real red states in America. You just wait, because it'll be a kind of socialism that'll be more radical and hardline and Odinist and willing to sacrifice than you could ever imagine. When this country goes really red, it'll go really red. This country will teach the world a thing or two about Marxism and socialism. These bohemian middle-class kids will be terrified. They'll be terrified. I mean, they won't know what hit them, right? They get mad when they see me on here ranting. Imagine what happens when it really hits home. Imagine when middle America turns anti-imperialist for real. How much it's going to be full of oomph and anger and valor and grit and sacrifice. You just wait until we have a broad mass anti-imperialist bloc among the American population. Because it'll have to be. Because that's how the American people are. Deep down in their blood, deep down in their guts, they believe they can do things if they work hard enough. They believe that they're sacrifice, and they don't surrender. When they pick a hill they want to die on, they cock their rifle and say, "Come get me." Showdown at the OK Corral. When middle America decides, finally comes to the conclusion that socialism is the answer, that U.S. imperialism must be defeated, it'll be far scarier than any peaceful, legal, single-issue protest in Washington, D.C., I can guarantee you that much. It'll be far scarier than any Bernie Sanders safe space, I'll tell you that much. When middle America starts moving, and it'll be a while before they start to move, but when middle America starts to move, it will move like a mountain. It'll move like a boulder. This whole world will shake when the American working class starts to move. You better believe it, folks. You better believe it. And I'll just conclude my opening remarks for tonight by telling you all something that needs to be said, which is that I know that this is going to happen because I've seen it in my own life. Folks, I always, my birthday, December 30th, it's kind of a special day for me, not just because I was born on that day, but because December 30th, 2010 is the day that I moved to New York City. December 30th, 2010. I had long hair. I had a beard. I had a lot of rotten, clothes with holes in them. And I packed up everything I had in Cleveland. And I got on a Greyhound bus. And I came to New York City. I got on that bus the night before. And I took some NyQuil. And I went to sleep. And then the sun woke me up. And we were at that point almost in New Jersey. We were almost in from Pennsylvania, almost at the end of Pennsylvania in New Jersey. And pretty soon we were going into the tunnel, and I was in Manhattan on my birthday, December 30th, 2010. I was 23 years old. And I thought I was coming to New York City for a month. And before I left town, my relatives, my parents, and my brother sat me down and said, "Don't go. Don't go. Don't go to New York City, Caleb. You've been doing this communist thing. But you gotta just move on. This ain't going nowhere. Just don't do this. Don't do this." People whispered to me, "You're in a cult. You're in a cult, Caleb. You're in a cult. Everybody knows Stalin killed millions of people. Everyone knows Mao killed millions of people. You're in this wacky group of people that like Putin and like North Korea and like China. You're in a cult. You're not in college anymore. You're struggling to keep your job at gas stations. Just don't go. Don't go. Just give this up. Don't go. Don't go. Come on, man. Come on. Just, it was a college phase. You sold a lot of newspapers, but you got to get your shit together, man. You're selling your blood plasma to survive. You went for days without food. Don't do it. Just give this up. Don't do it. Just don't do it. And I said, I'm only going there for a month. That's funny, isn't it? I'm only going there for a month. I can go up there for a month and see what it's like. I can go to New York for a month. Look, the party wants me to go to New York for a month. I can go up to New York for a month. I can do that. Well, I did come back a month later to get all the rest of my stuff and get back on that Greyhound bus. And I've lived in New York City ever since. I worked at an insurance firm for a while. I worked at an insurance firm, and then I worked for former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, a great anti-imperialist who exposed the lies of the war criminals in international court and was a great hero and revolutionary who was Saddam Hussein's lawyer, was Milosevic's lawyer. And I started appearing on international television, and I got arrested at Occupy Wall Street. and I got arrested at an MTA board hearing, and I went to Iran, and I went to the Middle East on a Red Crescent mission with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and holy shit, look where I am now. Look where I am now. A lot's gone on since December 30th, 2010. A lot has happened. A lot has happened. And I got to tell you all, as much as I'm all about compassion, I'm not against compassion. I'm not against kindness. I'm not against people loving each other. And people helped me out. I got a lot of help to be where I am. There's been so many people who've been generous and kind and compassionate, have presented me with opportunities I wouldn't have had. So please don't get me wrong. I'm not claiming I'm a self-made man. I am not that. There are no self-made men or self-made women. Such a thing doesn't exist. But I'm telling you that in the circumstances I was in before I left Cleveland, and in the circumstances that I was in for the first couple of years in New York, and some of the circumstances I've been in times since then, I know that what kept me going was some of that pioneer, Odinist, hardworking American grit. That my ability to maintain myself as a socialist, to keep going against all odds, is rooted in some of that hardworking and sacrifice and keep going and fighting and keep pushing back against the world, keep pushing back, never be held down. Part of what has kept me alive, part of what has enabled me to keep going is a strength that comes from within, a spiritual power that you tap into. Some things cannot be explained by dialectical and historical materialism, my friends. Sometimes you have to recognize the spiritual realm. You have to come to terms with the fact that there are spiritual forces in this world. There is power that is greater than any human can comprehend in this world. You have to admit that. You have to realize that you can't do it all alone. You have to realize that. You have to recognize that. But you also have to recognize that the more you love other people, the more you care for other people, the more you listen to other people, the more you have compassion and love in your heart, the stronger you get. The weakest person is the person who just stares into the mirror all day. One of the ways to be a stronger person, one of the ways to gain strength of character, is through not being caught up in yourself, but being able to look into the soul of another, to look into the heart of another. That this power, this ability to keep going in the face of so much hardship, it's not even only within yourself. It's in your ability to overcome the individualism. It's in your ability to love. It's in your ability to make yourself love. It's in the ability to overcome your rage. It's in your ability to forgive. It's in your ability to be compassionate. It's in your ability to just love humanity, to want the best for people around you, to find other people interesting, to see new circumstances as an opportunity. I was listening to something the other day and I heard a phrase that I like. It said, "Don't compete, create." Don't compete, create. And I like that. Don't compete, create. Tunnel vision. Tunnel vision. Because this community has done its best work. This community has done its best work when our enemies don't exist, when our competitors don't exist, when our opponents don't exist. And when we say we want to do this job, and we do it. And that is when we do our best work. When we're not worried about the naysayers and the fence sitters and our opponents, when we're not worried about other problematic noise that's out in the universe. But when we say we are going to do what we're going to do, and we're going to do it as the best we can, that's when we do the best work. And my goal for 2023 will be to have that tunnel vision, to focus on you guys, to focus on this community and how much I love it. Focus on solidifying and making this community more cohesive. And with this community, creating, building, solidifying. I have a feeling 2023 is going to be a great year. And great in a good way. Merry Christmas, everyone. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. Names and locations, names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Who is with us tonight? All right. Ianatan Mahari is in the United Kingdom. Very good. You're the first name that I saw. Who else is with us? Jenny Lynn says, thanks, Caleb. Merry Christmas. Maupin Time is in Scotland. Very, very good. St. David's, Bermuda. Merry Christmas, Caleb, says Miss Mosquito Swarm. Ryan in Kansas City. We got Wano in Aussie, Mexico. Jim in Franklin, PA. Stephen Ann in Georgia. JT24 in Mississippi. Karen Mendes in Germany. Stephen Ann in Georgia. Kieran in San Diego. Alexis in Rochester, New York. Joe in South Jersey. Merry Christmas. Rupert in England. Timoshenko in St. Louis, David Rennie in Hamilton, Ontario, Rochester, New York, Mark in Utica, David Fox is currently in Sydney for Christmas, Anthony in Detroit, we got North Pole, Santa's Cottage, Christian, LZ in PCUSA, California, Austin, Texas, Riverside, California, Los Angeles, Northern Michigan, Solidarity, my good comrade out in Miami, shout out to you, Cubanidad. Oh, wow. I was just talking to you the other day. So glad you're on here. We got Niami in Canada. We got Patch in Arizona. Harold Hedge. Christmas to everyone. Very, very, very good. We got Mr. Maupin. I'd like to attend your conference the 25th of March. I'd like to have you there, my friend, once we can announce the the location. Very good. We got watching from Trenton, New Jersey, Louis Garbon. We got Lori is in Austin for Christmas. Usually she's in Oklahoma, but now she's in Austin. We got Kane in Gateshead, England. Deborah Wilson is out in Florida. Shout out to you, Deborah. Good stuff. We got Bub in Missouri. Bub is with us in Missouri. Welcome, 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 everybody. Curtis in Houston, Texas is with us. Welcome, Curtis. Welcome, welcome. And anybody else? Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Oh, and they're going to come right in here in a second. That's how StreamYard works. There they go. They boomed right in. We got Pahe from Albuquerque. We got Zanetta from Macedonia, but true, but not Greece. Very good. Very, very good. Cleveland, Pirate Alex. We got Ottawa, Canada, Rogue Valley, Cedric in Massachusetts, Edward Allen in Kentucky, Phuket, Thailand, Utah, says Sage Rage. Welcome from Utah. Good stuff. Good stuff. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Good times, good times. All right. So now we are going to start answering Super Chat questions. First Super Chat question. What did Trotsky say about economics? So we got Neil Fraser in Hong Kong. What did Trotsky say about economics? A lot. Trotsky said a lot about economics. And that's one reason that I would argue that Trotsky was, the synthetic left is rooted. They have some of Trotsky's negative tendencies, but Trotsky was not part of the synthetic left. Trotsky was holding on to classical Marxism. He wasn't ready to go full all in with Bolshevism. He had one foot in Bolshevism and one foot in classical Eurocentric Marxism. I argue at this point that there have been three socialist movements in history. The first socialist movement was the scientific socialism of Marx and Engels. The second was the reactionary, the fascism, right? The fascist anti-capitalism, which, during and later Hitler and Mussolini and all of them, and that neither of those two first socialist movements ever created socialism. The original scientific socialism of Marx and Engels degenerated into social democracy and globalism, and the fascism created authoritarian fascist states in World War II and never created socialism. But that Bolshevism was the very beginning of a new socialism. It was a break. It was a significant break with Marx and Engels, and it was a break with the European style of doing things. The party of new type was a uniquely Russian and Eurasian formation. The theory of imperialism and the economics of imperialism, the vanguard party, etc. And then later with the rise of Stalin, and that Marxism. As Marxism left Europe, it stopped being the Marxism of Marx and Engels, but it definitely didn't turn into fascism either. That there is a third socialist movement. That is what I maintain. Trotsky resisted that break with European Marxism. And that is why Trotsky, I would argue, he was not good. He still held on to the belief, his belief, theory of permanent revolution, was that communism had to spread to Western Europe. That was his belief, that communism had to spread to Western Europe or else it didn't matter. The peasantry were too reactionary. You can't have peasants be part of a revolution. He rejected the Bolsheviks' alliance with the peasantry. He rejected the idea that they could have full socialism in the Soviet Union. He was focused on maintaining the Europeanness and the first worldness of Marxism. And he understood that European social democracy was becoming counter-revolutionary, but he just wasn't willing to turn his back on it. And after Trotsky left the Communist International, what did he do? He launched the French Turn, and they joined the social democratic parties. And all over the world, you see an alliance. Trotskyites often will align with social democrats. So that is really where I would critique Trotsky. However, if you just want to learn like the basics of Marxist economics, there's a lot of good stuff that Trotsky wrote about Marxist economics. There's a pamphlet by Trotsky that that I actually enjoyed reading. It's called Marxism in Our Time. And in that pamphlet, he talks about how neither the New Deal or fascism can save capitalism. He talks about like kind of the basics of Marxist economics. It's a pretty good pamphlet. It's, maybe 30, 40 pages long, maybe longer, but it's Marxism in Our Time by Leon Trotsky. And I recommend that. It's a pretty good pamphlet. It's pretty well put together pamphlet. I recommend it. And that's where the phrase A does not equal A. That's where I first heard it. Now it's in Dialectics of Nature, I understand. But that's where I first heard it. One of these people that we're trying not to acknowledge, one of the haters, claims that I invented A does not equal A to rebut Ayn Rand. Well, that's not true. Ayn Rand didn't say A equals A until the 1950s. She said A equals A, right? But Trotsky said A does not equal A in his Marxism in Our Time. And he pulled that from Frederick Engels, who said A does not equal A in the Dialectics of Nature. It's just a basic way of expressing the dialectical philosophy that all things are constantly in motion. But Trotsky wrote a lot about economics, right? He wrote about the economics of the Soviet Union. And if you read The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky, which is his big attack on Stalin, in that book, he makes a very strong case. There's a whole section of that book dedicated to explaining why the Soviet Union was not capitalist, that the people who didn't like the Soviet Union were saying the Soviet Union was state capitalism. Trotsky goes at great lengths showing that that is not true, that the Soviet Union was not a capitalist country, did not have capitalist property relations, that it had a bureaucracy, it had a group of people at the top who had more money than everybody else and had, bureaucratic privilege, and they had, bigger houses and fancier cars than everybody else. No one disputes that. but that they were not exploiters, right? That they got a bigger slice of the pie than everybody else, but it came out of the same pie. They were not living at the expense of the workers, right? They did not have a relationship with the workers that was the same as a capitalist relationship, right? They were a lot like the labor union bosses, and that the Soviet bureaucracy was not a capitalist class. And Trotsky does a very good job of explaining that and explaining the economics of the Soviet Union. So you can draw a lot from Trotsky's work, but the big problem with Trotsky's work is he says in his writings that the Soviet Union becoming a bureaucratic country, having a bureaucracy and rejecting the theory of permanent revolution was necessary. It had to happen. The population of the Soviet Union wasn't ready for a war, wasn't ready for more war. They weren't going to accept his theory of permanent revolution. He says that, he basically says that the Soviet Union, the way that they developed is how they would have had to develop under those circumstances. So then that raises the question, why does he condemn them for it? There's a lot of that in Trotsky, right? That he's much more, he has this cynical, negative view of the Soviet Union, and that enables him to speak more honestly about the problems that the Soviet Union had. But why does he blame them for that? Why does he just not recognize the Soviet Union was under attack? The Soviet Union was surrounded by Western capitalism, trying to build socialism under very hostile circumstances, and that these things would develop. Why does he moralize it, right? He condemns the Soviet Union for things that the Soviet Union would have had to do to survive. And that's the problem that I take with Trotsky. But if you want to learn Marxist economics, there's a lot of good things that Trotsky wrote. I'm looking over my Trotsky stuff, but yeah. He wrote a lot of good things about economics, but yeah, there you go. And that's, the synthetic left isn't concerned about economics. The synthetic left is concerned about nonconformity, etc. Trotsky was very concerned about economics. He talks about the workers' struggle, the capitalists, the labor union bureaucracy, the crisis of overproduction. If you want to understand the nature of capitalist crisis and where fascism came from and where, Roosevelt came from and the Bonapartism, go read Marxism in Our Time by Trotsky. It's a pamphlet he wrote in the 1930s explaining what was going on in the world and the Marxist economic theories. It's a pretty good pamphlet. So there you go. There you go. Trotsky wrote a lot about economics. So I hope that answers your question. Next question is, what does Thomas Piketty, does he offer a good analysis of capitalism? And my answer is no. Okay. And I have looked into Thomas Piketty's work, and that piece, Capital in the 20th century, that he wrote is not very good. First of all, he does not acknowledge any social movements. That is the biggest flaw in it. He talks about how in the 1950s there was a huge rise in the welfare state. He talks about, the creation of the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. And he talks about it as if it arose from thin air. He does not acknowledge the power of social movements. Social movements don't exist in Thomas Piketty's narrative. He doesn't recognize that working class power forced the hand of the capitalist class. He doesn't recognize that the existence of the Soviet Union, forced the capitalist countries to give a better deal to their workers so they didn't have a communist revolution. There's none of that is acknowledged in Piketty's work. He views it all as if people were just sitting there dreaming up economic policy in a vacuum. Thomas Piketty's narrative is basically that capitalism and the free market has problems. And in the past, we've implemented welfare states as a solution to those problems. And yeah, the welfare state had problems. We can acknowledge that. But, then in the 70s and 80s, we started dramatically, implementing free market neoliberalism. And that has created a whole bunch of problems. It's viewed from a purely economic policy standpoint. And there is no acknowledgement of class forces, no acknowledgement of the power of the labor movement enforcing, these concessions from the capitalists, no acknowledgement. It's all just, he sees economic policy in capitalist countries as simply an academic argument, that there are some academic economists who advocate neoliberalism. There are some academic economists that are from the Keynesian tradition and advocate the welfare state. He has written out, he does not acknowledge the existence of class struggle. And that is a really big problem with his worldview. And that is my biggest critique of Thomas Piketty, right? And that he also doesn't really acknowledge real Marxism. He acknowledges social democracy and he acknowledges neoliberalism, but he doesn't acknowledge real Marxism. He doesn't talk about overproduction. He just talks about, you know, the problems with not having a welfare state. He talks about the problems of privatizing government functions. He talks about these things. If folks have more super chats they want me to talk about, by all means, please send them this way. We do appreciate Gala's very generous Merry Christmas super chat. You know, and I only have one more after Thomas Piketty here. So if there's anything else people want me to talk about, by all means, shoot me a super chat, because I got plenty more energy here, folks. It's Christmas Eve, but you know, I'm not headed to bed anytime soon. So please, if you want to make the second half of this show go on, please send more questions, because I like talking. Oh, here's one. Is it crucial for a communist? All right. Very good. Very good. But yeah, that's my critique of Thomas Piketty's work. That is my critique, because he does not acknowledge class struggle. He doesn't acknowledge the Marxist critique of capitalism. He acknowledges a social democratic critique of neoliberalism. That's really as far as he goes. And that's one thing I've really noticed since 2008. I mean, it's been a while, right? That's like, we're 2023. So 2008 was a long time ago. But since 2008, suddenly you're allowed to be critical of capitalism. But they do work really hard to obscure the kinds of things we talk about on here. The tendency of the rate of profits to fall. The problem of overproduction. They don't want to talk about that. Richard Wolff won't go there. He will not go there. He'll talk about how the greed of capitalists drives them to pay the workers less. He'll talk about greedy corporations hurting workers. He will not talk. He will not talk. He will not talk. And thank you, Bismuth. He will not talk about, and everyone should go subscribe to his YouTube channel, by the way. Bismuth is awesome. And thank you, David Rennie. We do appreciate it. We do appreciate it. He will not talk about any, anything to do with overproduction, anything to do with the tendency of the rate of profits to fall, anything to do with how, the capitalist market and production developing and technology leads to an inevitable glut of overproduction. That's off limits. It's just not allowed to be discussed. And even like David Harvey, people like that, they'll talk about it if you prompt them, but they get very nervous. It's weird. It's very, very weird. And it's so obvious that that's what the problem is. We're so very clearly living in a long-term crisis of overproduction. That's what we're living in, right? The computer revolution and all of that. That's what we're living in. But people just won't go there. So there you go. There you go. Next question. What about the wishing for the USSR to return among tankies? Well, look, Vladimir Putin has said many times that if you don't mourn the loss of the Soviet Union, you have no heart. But if you expect the Soviet Union to return, you have no brain. He said that many times. That's been one of his lines. Writing it down. That's one of his lines, right? And what's funny is you'll see this quoted in American publications, and they'll be like, he mourned the loss of the Soviet Union. Oh my God, who could ever mourn the loss of the Soviet Union? Whenever American commentators talk about Russia, they are pandering to an audience that knows nothing about it. And they are completely out of touch with reality. And it's like they don't realize that the fall of the Soviet Union was a huge economic catastrophe. Like Russia's economy collapsed, and millions of people were hungry and unemployed, and the population of Russia decreased by 10%, and millions of people either died or left the country. Mass unemployment, mass homelessness. I mean, it was like the fall of the Soviet Union was an absolute nightmare. But in America, we just think this fall of the Soviet Union was a bunch of people going, yay, freedom, woo, we're free. They just think it was a big party with fireworks going off the whole time. That's an American media. Whenever they show the fall of the Soviet Union, they show us some statue falling over, and then they show fireworks, and that's what you think it was. Well, it was actually millions of people losing their jobs, millions of factories closing down, millions of collective farms shutting down, the rate of homelessness rising, drug gangs setting up, human trafficking. The fall of the Soviet Union was a humanitarian and economic nightmare and disaster. You never would know that if you watch American media. So they will actually present quotes from Putin where he says, if you don't mourn the fall of the Soviet Union, you have no heart, and be like, aha, see, he's a Stalinist. No one would mourn the fall of the Soviet Union. Aha, we got him. And it's just like, you just want to slap these people. How can they be so stupid? Like everybody, BBC has documentaries about it. The fall of the Soviet Union was a nightmare. Any moral person would mourn the economic disaster that followed the implementation of free market capitalism across Eastern Europe. It was a disaster. And because it doesn't fit the free market narrative, because we're led to believe that capitalism leads and markets magically lead to prosperity, no one wants to acknowledge that the restoration of capitalism in the former Soviet Union was a disaster. It was a huge economic disaster. No one wants to acknowledge that. And because no one acknowledges that, you get very, very dumb statements said by critics of Putin. But regardless, I'm not going to leave it at that. Because we're at the point now, like Belarus, there's talk of Belarus reintegrating with Russia. I'm not saying it'll happen, but there's talk of that, right? These countries, Donetsk, People's Republic, Lugansk, they voted to join with Russia. And I think there is an increasing feeling in that part of the world that because the United States is so aggressive, because the USA is funding Ukrainian Nazis and pouring billions of dollars of weapons into Kiev right now, and because the USA fomented unrest in Kazakhstan, and because of everything the United States has done in that part of the world to cause problems, I think there is increasingly a feeling among some people in that part of the world that they'd be better together. And if maybe it wouldn't be the Soviet Union, right? Maybe it wouldn't be the Soviet Union, but some kind of alliance, some kind of regroupment. They already have the collective security agreement and the military treaty that they have, and that I think that there is a feeling in that part of the world that something, not the Soviet Union, but some kind of anti-imperialist, anti-NATO alliance, some kind of, more cohesive alliance of anti-imperialist forces in that part of the world might be a good thing. That wouldn't be the Soviet Union exactly, but if Belarus and different countries that were aligned with Russia were to, form some kind of bloc like the European Union or something, right? The European Union, they're not all one country, but they're closer together. If there was something like that, that might be good. So, okay. Wrote it down. Thank you, Andre. And we'll address that. So he, the idea that the Soviet Union, some kind of bloc of countries that are formerly part of the Soviet Union, might be a good thing. I don't think I think there is a feeling like that. So it wouldn't be the Soviet Union that would come back, though. And I think people who think that they're just going to unfurl the Soviet flag again and, it's going to be Soviet communism all over again. No, something new will come into existence. You can never go back, right? That's in The Great Gatsby, right? The Great Gatsby. You can't restore the past, but of course you can. Well, you can't restore the past. The history never returns, something like it. I think Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And yes, some kind of anti-imperialist bloc in that part of the world, made up of countries that are formerly part of the Soviet Union, may reemerge out of necessity. But will the Soviet Union itself return? No. The Soviet Union itself will not come back. And thank you, Ellie Marino, for your super chat in Rockfin. I'm glad you're watching, Ellie Marino. Shout out to you. I do appreciate it. So there we go. Let's go to the next question here. All right. Is it crucial for a communist party to hold a monopoly on state power in order to construct socialism? No, it's not. That's not what I believe. However, I would argue that it is crucial for the state, the nature of the state, to change. In Venezuela right now, we look at Venezuela, right? If you were stuck in the Cold War model, like some of these hardline MLs are, Venezuela can't be a socialist country, right? Because, the state that exists is the state that Hugo Chavez created, and Hugo Chavez was not a Marxist-Leninist. He called himself a 21st century socialist. He studied Lenin and Marx, but he was not a Marxist-Leninist. And, there's a lot of capitalists in Venezuela, and there's, opposition parties that have seats in the government, etc. So according to the classic ML thing, which is, no, it has to happen like the Bolsheviks. They overthrow capitalism. They create the revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. They establish a communist party. It's the ruling party, and they enact 5-year economic plans. If you follow that, Venezuela is not socialist. But look at Venezuela right now. How would Venezuela be any different if it was socialist? The major centers of economic power, the big commodity in Venezuela is oil. It's always been like an oil-centered economy. And in Venezuela, oil is in the hands of the state. And that oil revenue that's essential to the economy, that oil revenue is controlled by the state. And the state uses it to plan the economy. And the state uses it to build cooperatives. And the state uses it to fund a welfare programs and a welfare apparatus and the collectivos and the military, right? The military of Venezuela is more pro-communism and pro-Marxism than most of the population is, right? They're the most hardline supporters. They get their military training in Cuba. Plus, they have special ideological, they have what they call the Bolivarian militias, which are like these community neighborhood wings of the army that are run by communists. So how is Venezuela not socialist, right? If you look at it, I mean, it's got an economy that's pretty much state run, centered around the state. It's got Marxists and communists running the government. It's got a communist military. How is Venezuela not socialist? I mean, if this wasn't a full seizure of power, I mean, they would have been overthrown by now. It's pretty clear that the Marxists and communists and revolutionary forces in Venezuela have a monopoly on state power. But there are opposition parties in the government. There are non-communist, anti-communist forces that are part of the government. It's not Cuba. It's not North Korea. Venezuela is clearly a socialist state at this point. They don't call themselves that. They say we're on the road to socialism. But in my understanding of socialism, Venezuela is a socialist country. But a communist party does not have a monopoly on political power. There are non-communist parties that have seats in the Venezuelan government. That's true. There are other things about Venezuela, and I mean, the same could be said for Libya. The same could be said for Syria. In Syria, there are non-socialist, non-Marxist parties everywhere. But I mean, if you look at Syria's economy, it's state-run. Ba'athist era socialism, in an alliance with the Communist Party, in an alliance with the Social Nationalist Party, they run the economy. And then I argue that this belief that only Marxist-Leninist countries are socialist, I argue that that's bunk, right? Can you speak about the Soviet Union before its rise? Who was in power and why those in power were overthrown? Before its rise? What does that mean? All right. So there you go. All righty. All righty. All right. Yeah, I mean, I don't argue that you have to have a Marxist-Leninist party in the government in order to be a socialist country. I just don't accept that. I don't think that's correct. All right. What's happening with Pedro Castillo in Peru? It's a coup. I mean, this is he came into power in alliance with Biden. That's pretty clear, right? That Biden, and that's the new thing, is that the Biden administration and the woke power in the United States is at this point more threatened by right-wing nationalists in Latin America than they are by the left. They don't like Venezuela. They don't like Nicaragua, but they have figured out, that there is a wing of leftism in Latin America that's not a threat to them. This president of Honduras who got elected, Xiomara Castro, she, what's her name? Kamala Harris went to the inauguration. She attended it. And, the Colombian government and the government of Chile, they speak left in their messaging, but they are not. And they're anti-Russia, they're anti-China, and they don't believe in economic growth. They're crazy environmentalists, and they are pro-drugs, and they are tied in with the narco gangs, and they believe in drugs. And this is woke stuff. Now, Pedro Castillo is a little bit different. See, Pedro Castillo got elected in an alliance with those forces, but he himself is a more genuine leftist, right? And the United States said, okay, Pedro Castillo, he's a genuine leftist. We got these fake leftists that he's in an alliance with, so we'll let this happen, right? And then he appointed a foreign minister who was a communist, and they ousted his foreign minister. And Pedro Castillo, there's different forces in the coalition. It was a popular front. And it became clear that Pedro Castillo and the people that he came into power in alliance with him weren't on his side. And there was a big push and pull inside of the coalition that brought him to power. And ultimately, they ousted him. And it was the same kind of bullshit they always do, corruption and, the same kind of stuff. And the same with Christina Kirchner, right? Again, she's a leftist and she's a full-on anti-imperialist and revolutionary, but she's in an alliance with complicated forces, right? There's other forces in her coalition. And now she's been kind of locked out of politics. And Lula da Silva, in order to get back into power, they let Lula da Silva before the Bolsheviks. Okay. All right. All right. So, okay, I'll write that down, Funky. All right. All right. So there you go. And that's the problem, is that there's a synthetic left in Latin America now, right? And that the U.S. imperialists, look, there's something called WACL. I don't know if folks know about WACL, right? It's the World Anti-Communist League, the WACL. And the WACL are not nice people. The WACL are the Contras of Nicaragua. The WACL was funded by Chiang Kai-shek. The WACL was funded. I mean, those are not nice people. It's Marcos and his henchmen in the Philippines and, Rios Montt in Guatemala. The WACL, they're not good guys, right? And all throughout Latin America, that was who the United States was aligned with. The paramilitaries in Colombia that murdered communists and leftists and trade unionists and the FARC, the Contras of Nicaragua, the Rios Montt government, the El Salvador regime. There's all kinds of, right-wing anti-communists in Latin America. The thing about all of them is they're all white. Right? Latin America race is a little bit different, right? In the United States, it's like one drop rule, right? You got one drop of black blood, you're black. You got one drop of Latin blood, you're Latin. Not like that in Latin America. It's more of a shadeism. The whiter you are, the wealthier you are, the higher up you are, the darker you are, the more discriminated against you are, right? And in Latin America, the most discriminated against people and the poorest people tend to be the indigenous folks that are very, very dark, or the African folks that are very, very dark. And the most privileged people in Latin American society tend to be the lightest, the people that are Spaniard descended, they are the most privileged. And there's kind of a, the lighter you are, the more privilege you have, right? It's not like that in the United States. You're whiter, you're not in the United States. Not like that, but in Latin America, it's a little bit different. And the right wing of Latin America, historically, the people who hated Hugo Chavez from the beginning, the people who fled Cuba to get away from Fidel Castro, the people who backed Rios Montt in Guatemala, they were the lightest skinned people. And those folks are really racist, and they're really elitist, and they really don't like indigenous people. They don't like indigenous people. They consider indigenous people to be inferior. And that's just the reality of the situation. And it used to be those people were enough of a block that they could hold a society together. Pinochet would come to power in Chile, and he would take care of those folks, and then he would, brutally repress and beat down the other people in Chilean society, and Pinochet could stay in power, right? Rios Montt could come to power in Guatemala. He could take care of those folks, and he could genocide the indigenous people, and he could stay in power. Not anymore. Now, indigenous folks are voting all across Latin America. Indigenous folks didn't used to vote. Did you know that? All across Latin America, indigenous folks were locked out of the electoral process. They didn't speak the language. They didn't speak Spanish, and they wouldn't get to vote. They would just be in their tribes, in their cities, without running water up in the mountains, and everyone would just ignore them. Now they vote. And the way the socialist governments, Evo Morales, and in Venezuela, the socialist government of Venezuela and in Nicaragua, the way they've gained power is they take care of these people, and they give them electricity, and they give them running water, and they give them access to healthcare. So they vote for the left. And the right wing, now that those folks, because of modern technology and modernization and Chinese investment, even in, non-socialist countries, Chinese investment has brought electrification, etc. Those folks are voting. And the whole, the wacko song and dance that the Rios Montt people and the paramilitaries in Colombia do, and the Pinochet supporters in Chile do, that doesn't fly with those folks. Doesn't fly. I mean, these folks, one of their biggest arguments against Hugo Chavez was that he has black heritage. He has some Afro-Venezuelan heritage. That was one of their biggest arguments against him. And I see Hugo Chavez, I don't see a black man. But because he had some black blood in him, they would make cartoons of Hugo Chavez where he looked like a monkey. They would say, isn't it humiliating that Venezuela, this civilized country, is ruled by a black man? They would just make blatantly racist appeals. Well, that might work among the white folks. But now that the indigenous population, the people who live up in the mountains, the impoverished people, now that they can all vote, they hear that shit and they're just like, I'm not voting for you. And that the wacko, you can call them, the World Anti-Communist League, the people call them the Gusanos, the Miami lobby. They're not all in Miami, though. A lot of them are in South America. They can't win elections anymore. They can't win elections anymore because they're not the majority. Though they don't have electoral majorities. They can't win elections. And because they can't win elections, the United States has gone, oh shit. And this is why we lost control of Latin America. We put all of our resources and all of our money into these people. And these people are brutal, and they can kill people, and they can slaughter indigenous people and stuff, but they just aren't the majority anymore. So they're not going to be able to win elections. And the United States has been rethinking its Latin American strategy in the past, since the Obama years. The United States has been going back to the drawing board and trying to draw up its anti-communist strategy for Latin America. And now the song and dance that pro-U.S. forces use in Latin America is different. For example, Enrique Capriles was the big opposition figure in Venezuela for a long time. And his line was not, Hugo Chavez is black, so he's bad, and all of his supporters are indigenous people who are inferior, and capitalism is great. If we just have free market capitalism, we can be rich like America. He didn't try that. Enrique Capriles, his line was, well, I'm a socialist too. But I'm going to do socialism in a way that doesn't make the United States so mad. And Maduro is just such an extremist. He's made the United States mad at us, and that's why we're getting hit with these sanctions. And Maduro, he's so determined to fight the United States that by golly, he's locking us opposition people that just want to get along with the United States out of power, right? And that's the line. right, is that we're socialists, but we're not the bad kind. We're socialists, but we're not anti-imperialist. We want, oh, sure, we want to give people stuff. We want to give people healthcare and education. Oh, yeah, we want to do that. We're not against that. But geez, we got to have American democracy. And, we could do it better if America gave us trade deals and they try to obscure the reality of the situation, which is that the United States, the reason it impoverishes countries in South and Central America is not because of what Maduro says. It's not because of what Evo Morales says. It's because they exist. It's because that's how imperialism works. That's how austerity works. That's how, Wall Street imperialism works, is you impoverish countries and you beat them down so you can maintain a monopoly for Western capitalism, right? So that's the reason. That's the reason. But the USA has had to kind of reinvent its political strategy in South America in order to stay in power. And a big part of that has been the Pope. Believe it or not, Pope Francis has been a big part of that. During the Obama years, the Pope, all of a sudden, he was a socialist. He wasn't a Marxist, but he was a socialist. And he started criticizing capitalism. And he started going around Latin America saying leftist-sounding stuff. And that was part of that, right? Because that was, it used to be the Pope would say anti-communist stuff, right? It used to be the Pope was always, well, now it was like, no, we need to kind of steal the communist thunder. And so kind of reinventing, creating this synthetic left in Latin America has been very key in the United States, the United States changing its strategy in South and Central America. And that's what has led to, Pedro Castillo won the elections, but he was in an alliance with the fake left and they turned on him and removed him. And the government of Colombia, yeah, that guy sounds like a leftist, but he ain't. He's not a revolutionary. The Chilean government, they're not revolutionaries. Nicaragua, those are revolutionaries, right? Venezuela, Maduro, that's a revolutionary there. But that's the game. So I just wanted to explain all of that. That's really important for people to understand. And that these maneuvers, if you just stick with a standard 1970s leftist narrative, you're going to be completely lost. Right? The way Americans used to talk about, the way leftists, I should say, used to talk about Latin America was accurate during the Cold War, which is that across Latin America, the people vote for socialists. People vote for socialists, and the USA backs military juntas and military strongmen to overthrow socialism. That's what happened. It happened in Argentina. It happened in Chile. It happened in Guatemala and Honduras, and it happened in country after country after country. In Colombia, that's true, right? That when the people had the opportunity to go to the polls and vote, they voted socialist. So the USA was backing all these military tyrants and strongmen to keep capitalism. That's what was happening in like the 60s, 70s, and up into the 80s. Things changed. Late 80s, the USA started democratizing all these countries because the dictators were getting in the way of austerity. These military regimes that the USA was backing, in order to have a dictatorship, you have to take care of somebody. There has to be a section of the population who benefits from it. And if you don't, Pinochet, he tried to do the free market stuff for the first 5 or 6 years he was in power, and he completely wrecked Chile. And starting in the early 80s, Pinochet started nationalizing industries, and he started, handing out the goods to the military, and he stabilized Chile's economy. The Chilean economic miracle happened when Pinochet stopped doing the free market stuff because he couldn't keep his dictatorship in power. There was going to be a revolt. And the same goes for Argentina. The same goes for many of these countries, that you can't have a military authoritarian regime and neoliberal economics, because neoliberal economics will lead to so much poverty that your military regime will be toppled. And so the United States started removing these various military strongmen and replacing them with weak neoliberal governments. And you remember Ecuador in the 1990s, I was there when I was a kid in 1999, Ecuador's economy was crashing and burning, and the president would resign and a new president would come in, and the new president would come in and be like, I don't know what we're going to do. Oh boy. And then he would quit, and then you get a new president. Oh boy, what are we going to do? And then he would resign. There was a joke they had for a while. I think it was the Capitol steps. They had it's the 5th time in 2 weeks we've seen a president of Argentina, and they were joking about it. In the late 90s, early 2000s, the Argentine governments were collapsing left and right because they would be weak, pathetic governments that, that couldn't do anything strong, right? They couldn't take any strength. They would just be these kind of pathetic, weak governments that would roll over and let the international bankers, the IMF, the World Bank, do whatever they want, and they couldn't fix the economy. And out of the crisis of neoliberalism, that's when you got the rise of Bolivarianism. And that was, starting in the late 90s in Venezuela, and then eventually in 2006 or 2003, I think, in Bolivia. And then later, with the return of the Sandinistas in 2006. And you started to see like a Bonapartist current. It started out as a national bourgeoisie mobilization against austerity, which was wrecking their economies, but they entered an alliance with the proletariat. And then the proletariat got stronger and became the dominant partner in the coalition. And Cuba was their ally and China was their ally. And then eventually these countries started moving towards socialism, right? And it was a Bonapartist struggle within the ruling class between the national bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie in response to an ongoing capitalist crisis that was wrecking the country. And you got the rise of Bolivarianism. And Bolivarianism, the way it took power was by empowering the indigenous folks. They were the section of the population that was this silent majority. You want to talk about a silent majority. Indigenous people, darker skinned people are the majority of South America, but because they were locked out of the political process, they couldn't vote. They weren't voting. I mean, they technically could, but they were up in the mountains and they weren't voting, and they didn't have electricity and they didn't have running water and they didn't speak Spanish, and they were the silent majority. Well, now things have changed, and those folks are voting, and those folks are speaking Spanish, and those folks do have electricity, and they do have running water, and they're voting, and they're very powerful. And the right wing can't get back into power now in Latin America. The right wing can't get back into power, the traditional right wing that is so racist and so elitist and, and hates indigenous people and wants the United States and believes in neoliberal free market stuff. They can't get back into power. So because of that, the United States has reinvented its strategy for South and Central America. And now they're fomenting synthetic leftism. And a big part of synthetic leftism is identity politics, right? Because they want to play up, they want to make it a fight of the indigenous population against the non-indigenous population. They want to do it about ID poll, right? And they like, the kind of mystical admiration for the indigenous people plays into their belief in degrowth and deindustrialization and all of that. So we're seeing the rise. The United States is fomenting a synthetic left in Latin America. And I think that's important for people to understand. And then again, if you just sit there and repeat 1970s cliches about USA backing dictators, you're way behind. You're way behind. And I hear a lot of these boomer leftists, they do that. And they just sit there and they just repeat, the USA backed Pinochet. It's like Pinochet came to power in 1973. That's decades and decades and decades ago, my friend. You were way behind. Yes, that's true. But a lot has happened since then. The Soviet Union's fallen. There's been the rise of austerity and neoliberalism. And then there's been the rise of Bolivarian socialism. And now the United States is fomenting synthetic leftism. And honestly, the United States at this point is afraid of, if Castillo had not won the election, who would have been president? Fujimori. The daughter of Fujimori, the military dictator of Peru in the 90s. And if Fujimori had been president, there would have probably been some kind of revolution because the indigenous population wasn't going to take that. Fujimori was a brutal dictator who killed a lot of people in Peru. And, the USA Fujimori would be less stable and would probably, first of all, in order to stay in power, Fujimori would have had to do something. She would have had to do some Bonapartist shit and fix the economy. Right? Number one. And number two, Fujimori, the name Fujimori, I mean, this is a dictator of Japanese heritage who was ruling Peru. It was his daughter who would have defeated Castillo. If she'd been in power in Peru, that would have led to the indigenous population being up in arms. That would have strengthened real Marxism so much. But if they were able to have Castillo come into office, but be in a weak position where he was aligned with all these phonies who then stabbed him in the back, it was much more in the interest of the United States to have Castillo take office and not be able to carry out his program than it was to have Fujimori take office. Because if Fujimori had taken office, that would have polarized the country. And so these are complicated things to understand. But ultimately, what's happening now in Peru is horrendous. They're murdering leftists and they're cracking down on the real left. That's the thing. The fake left is going along with this, is betraying the communists, and they're going after the pro-Chinese, pro-Russian, pro-Cuban left. That's who they're targeting right now. They're not targeting the fake left. The pro-imperialist left is not being targeted. The fascism being unleashed in Peru right now is being unleashed against the genuine communist, anti-imperialist, pro-Bolivarian wing of the Castillo movement. And that's what you have to understand, that they're using this moment to kind of purge the left of genuine elements to pave the way. They want the debate to be between the right wing and the fake left. They don't want genuine anti-imperialism to be in power. Long-winded answer, but it's important to understand. All right. Why did Gorbachev fail and succumb to U.S. meddling? Not a question of failure, right? Starting very early. Okay, let me back up. If you read Socialism Betrayed, which I have a copy of here by Roger Kieran. I have a copy of it somewhere. If you read Socialism Betrayed by Roger Kieran, he talks about how there was always this wing of the Soviet Communist Party that basically said we can't really have socialism here. That the Bukharinite wing, the right opposition, they were the ones that said, look, we didn't have a revolution in Germany. They didn't have a communist revolution in Europe. We're screwed. Let's just make peace with the West and bring in some foreign investment. And maybe if we get rich enough, maybe we can start to have socialism. And that the Bukharinite, the right opposition in the Soviet Communist Party, that they weren't the left opposition like Trotsky. They weren't with Stalin. They were the right opposition led by Bukharin. They were social democrats when it got down to it. They really liked Kautsky. Their worldview was a lot closer to European social democracy. Okay. And that there was always a wing of the Soviet Communist Party that was not communist, right? That existed. And Stalin heavily suppressed them. Bukharin was executed. Zinoviev was executed. There was always this wing, this view within the Soviet Communist Party that, yeah, okay, we're here, but real socialism is like what the German Social Democrats want to do, right? And that existed. And then after the death of Stalin, at the same time in Europe, you had the rise of social democracy. You had the SPD in Germany that was rising and becoming very popular. The British Labour Party was in its more left-wing phase. It was nationalizing industries, Michael Foot and all of that. Or was it Michael Foot or Paul Foot or one of those guys? And Clement Attlee was on the right. Never mind. But anyway, you had this, social democracy was rising in Europe. And when Khrushchev gave the secret speech and condemned Stalin, that was that wing of the Soviet government signaling to the United States, don't worry, we're not hardliners like Stalin. We're more like Bukharin. We're more like that faction that didn't want to confront the West. Please, let's make a deal. Right? And so that faction of the Soviet Communist Party, it was not revolutionary, existed. Then, starting in the 1950s, the CIA started doing everything it could to help those people. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was funneling money into Europe and funding academics. But also, there was a huge amount of effort to highlight the voices of dissident communists. They called them reform communists, people within the Soviet governments and the Eastern European governments who were members of communist parties, but said, can't we just water this down a little bit? And that there was this current within the Soviet communist parties that weren't really into communism. And what the United States started doing was, with American intelligence, they started doing everything they could to funnel money and support and do everything they could to prop those people up, right? To give them covert support. And the Communist Party USA played a really big role in this, right? And the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, the reformist wing of the Soviet Communist Party, basically they felt that the Soviet Union needed to become a European social democratic welfare state. And they believed that the United States would let them do it. And they believed that Ronald Reagan was bad. Ronald Reagan was a warmonger. The Republicans were that. But there was this other wing of America. There was this nice mayor of Burlington, Vermont named Bernie Sanders. And he was nice. And there was Walter Mondale. And there were all these Democrats in America. And they were not so bad. And if the Soviet Union were to, throw in the towel and dissolve, America would back down and stop threatening them, and they'd be able to just kind of become like Norway or Sweden, and they'd have free healthcare and they'd have education for all, but they would have a market economy, and they would be just like a European country, right? That maybe they needed Stalin and the Bolshevik Revolution to build themselves up, but now they'd industrialized, so they didn't need that anymore. And, they could adopt like a Western liberal democratic political system, and they could maintain a welfare state, and they could get rid of the whole Marxism-Leninism thing. There was a big chunk of the Soviet Communist Party who believed that, and Gorbachev was one of those people. Gorbachev believed that. He believed that the Soviet Union could transition into being a European welfare state. That's what he believed. And he was wrong. But there was a huge effort to convince him of that, and that American intelligence and synthetic leftism played a really big role in that. And it was a cultural undermining, right? Soviet Union, they pushed socialist realism, and they had the paintings about revolutionary stuff. In the United States, we pushed modern art. It's just throwing paint on a canvas, right? Rock music and Beatles music and American movies and the hippie counterculture, all of this stuff seeped into the Soviet bureaucracy. A lot of the children of the Communist Party leaders, they believed that America was a really cool country. And yeah, okay, sure. Ronald Reagan was no good. The Republicans were bad. The military of America was bad. The right-wing cowboys were bad. But there were these people in America called hippies who believed in peace and love and had rock music, and they just wanted to use drugs, and they were artists, and that the problem wasn't capitalism or communism. It was about love, man. It was about love, man. It's just a global consciousness raising movement, brother. And we just got to have freedom, man, and think for yourself. We got to question authority, dude. And we just got to yeah, man, get stoned, brother. And, stop thinking about all this communism and capitalism. Just tune out, man. Get in touch with nature. And the hippie shit. The hippie shit was that stuff, because it was in theory anti-right wing. It was anti-militarist. It was against the Vietnam War. That stuff seeped into the Soviet Union gradually. And it wasn't easy, right? There were times where they outlawed that stuff. They banned Beatles music and stuff in the Soviet Union. But that the cultural leftism was gradually more and more embraced by the Soviet Communist Party, because they saw it, they thought supporting it and embracing it would help fight Reagan. And the anti-nuclear movement was big in the Soviet Union. The idea was that they could somehow, they could give up communism and be allowed to have capitalism in a way that would make Russia a strong country. And they didn't understand the nature of imperialism. There was another wing of the Soviet Communist Party they called the hardliners, and they were moving away from Marxism-Leninism also, but they were moving into Russian nationalism. They were moving into, Russian Orthodox stuff. And, they were into this conservative traditionalism and stuff. Right. And that in the 80s, it was very clear that the way things were going in the Soviet Union couldn't continue, and that Marxism was what everyone said they believed in. Marxism-Leninism was the official state ideology. However, beneath the surface, that was not what people believed, and that ideology wasn't taken seriously because it wasn't safe to really engage or debate about it. There was an atmosphere created that if you got up and talked about Marxism in too much detail, if you talked about it wrong, you might go to jail. So people that wanted to learn politics, they didn't learn Marxism, because if you asked too many questions about Marxism, if you said, hey, how about this? Can you explain this? Or I don't understand that, you might go to jail. So everyone talked about Marxism in a very vague way. It was the ideology they all mouthed belief in. But behind closed doors, one wing of the Soviet Party was believing in European social democracy and the synthetic left and hippie crap. And another wing of the Soviet Communist Party was believing in Tsarism and Orthodox nationalism, etc. And that was the divide. The hardliners were becoming traditionalists and Orthodox nationalists, and the reformists were becoming social democrats and hippies and countercultural postmodernists. And that was the division. And it's unfortunate. And the Soviet Union developed in a way they had to have this ironclad discipline, but it led to an atmosphere where the population was not learning Marxism. And there you go. All right. I gave an answer to that question. All right. Next question. Thomas Piketty highlights at the end that economic data is opaque, even to scholars like him. He is thorough and honest in a way. Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad that he exists, right? It's good to have someone push back against the neoliberal, barrage we've been hit with, this belief that free market capitalism is the only way. It's the only system that's ever worked. Anyone who doesn't believe in free markets and neoliberalism is an idiot, because clearly capitalism is the greatest system ever. We've all heard this crap our whole lives. And to have Thomas Piketty come forward as a very prominent intellectual and say, actually, no, the free market has a lot of problems, I appreciate it. And you speak about the Soviet, about who was there in the Soviet Union before it rose. Well, you have to remember, a lot of people say the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar. That's not true. The Tsar was overthrown by the provisional government. So you had Tsar Nicholas II. He was the Tsar. He'd been involved in this embarrassing scandal with this, there's Rasputin, this monk who did magic and cured his son of a disease and supposedly had an affair with the Tsar's wife. And the nobles got together and killed Rasputin. And World War I was happening, and World War I wasn't going very well. And so then, the Tsar was overthrown. And then you had the provisional government that was led by Alexander Kerensky. And the provisional government was continuing to fight in World War I, but it was very weak. And so that was the provisional government. And then you had Kornilov try to overthrow the provisional government. And then Kornilov was defeated, and then the Bolsheviks took power. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people just think, well, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar and seized power. Wrong. That's not what happened, right? It was quite a process, right? And you have to remember, 1905, there had been a huge uprising against the Tsar in 1905 that had involved a lot of socialists and communists and other forces, right? In response to the horrendous massacre, the Winter Palace, you had this big demonstration demanding food and bread, and then the crowd had been shot and killed, and so that, you had Father Gapon, who was this priest who we later find out was a government informant, was leading this big march of poor people to beg the Tsar for better economic conditions. And then the protest was fired on by the police. And then you had this huge uprising in 1905 that was crushed. And then you had the Stolypin reaction, where they started executing people afterwards, and there was a wave of executions and heavy repression, but they created the Duma, and they had elected representatives in government, and there were some reforms following the 1905 revolution. At the same time, there was heavy repression, all of this. And then it's ultimately the outbreak of World War I combined with the political crisis, where the Tsar, the Tsar and Tsar Nicholas II was, largely the majority of the Russian ruling class thought that Tsar Nicholas II was incompetent and wanted him removed because of World War I and the ensuing economic crisis, etc. And that led to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II and the establishment of the Kerensky government. And the Kerensky government then faced the opposition from the Kornilov reaction, and then that led ultimately to the Bolsheviks taking power. So it's a long, complicated thing. And a lot of people don't realize that. And that people have a very simplistic, when I was a kid, they took us to see that movie Anastasia, right? And this is it's like Disney or 20th Century Fox, and you watch it, and it's the way we talk about all these things is very, very simplistic. But there you go. All right, folks. Well, Merry Christmas to everybody. I'll probably be back on tomorrow. Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. Happy Hanukkah if you celebrate Hanukkah. Crazy Kwanzaa if you observe the Black nationalist holiday of Kwanzaa. And on top of that, if you are a person on planet Earth who observes our calendar, then I will say Happy New Year. And on that note, I'm going to actually play the video that someone made of our closing mantra. Because, I haven't played it in a while. I usually just say this, but we'll play it. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, Revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night, folks.